Welcome to Groundwater Rising. This podcast is all about flooding, and in particular, as the title suggests, we focus on one of the most overlooked and misunderstood types, groundwater flooding. Historically, it's the least monitored, it's the least talked about, and it's often the last thing on the list when discussing flood risk. And it's that lack of understanding that can leave communities confused, unprepared, and unheard. I'm Helen from Project Groundwater, and I'll be speaking to community members who live with groundwater flooding, alongside the researchers, engineers, and practitioners working to understand it better and to help reduce its impact. But I'm not here as a technical expert. I'm here to ask the questions that people outside of the sector might want to ask. Questions like, what does that actually mean and why does it matter to me? Together we'll explore those real experiences, the emerging research, the practical thinking from the water sector, academia and beyond, and we'll help make groundwater flooding something people can understand, talk about and plan for. Today I'm joined by Adrian Porter, who works at the Chilterns Chalk Streams project. Adrian brings a perspective that spans community experience, a practical flood response and river restoration. But rather than me explaining that to you, we're going to let him tell that story himself, because like many of the people that we speak to on this podcast, Adrian's journey into this work didn't start professionally. It started with a real experience of flooding and everything followed on from that. So Adrian, welcome to Groundwater Rising. If we can, could you take me back to 2007 and tell us what happened on that night?
That was the night of the summer floods that affected a lot of properties across southern England. But actually for us, the journey really began in 2004. At that time, my wife and I were looking for somewhere where we could bring up our soon-to-be family. So we settled ourselves in this village. In buying the house, we did some research and we were made aware that the property was in the 1 in 100 year flood event area. But at the time we were thinking, it's not a particularly large house. We won't be there for the rest of our lives. And so if we have the house for a 10-year period and it's a 1 in 100 flood risk, then actually the law of averages, the odds are in our favour, aren't they? We bought the house, we lived in there fantastically for 3 years, and then come 2007, as many people will remember who are listening to this, the summer storms happened, the waters came up, and we ended up being very badly inundated in our property over the period of mid-July 2007.
When did you first realise that it was a real risk for you?
So actually I was at work and my wife rang me, and it was the time the sewers were surcharging. So water was spurting out of them and filling the streets, and my wife rang me with a level of alarm. And so it was definitely time for me to come home. We spent the next few days recovering from that initial surcharge of water. There was no immediate impact, but it was kind of, okay, well, what did that mean? What happens? What happens now? Over those few days, the river system and the groundwater responds. So we could watch the fields nearby. This is part of the Oxford floodplain. It's a conveyance channel for the River Thames. As the water comes down from the upper Thames, the Thames bursts its banks and fills all those fields up. You could actually look at the water, and it had a slight meniscus on the front end of it, which meant the water was pushing. It was rising onto the new ground. And you can see this water creeping up towards the house. We had a house, it's a lovely property, it's 350 years old, there are no foundations on it, no flood defence at all. And I was thinking, if this water gets any closer, I'm going to be in real problems. I spent much of the next 3 days building concrete dams that I could put across the gateways and the walls just to prevent the water, try and create a barrage to prevent this surface water from coming in. Because the water was getting closer and because the concrete dams are not perfect, and because at the time I had no pumps to help protect or deal with any seepage, I was manually scooping the water over with a dustpan, trying to keep the water out of the garden. And it was a 24-hour game. I could rest for half an hour, perhaps an hour, that was it. So I was doing this for a 3-day period. At the end of those 3 days, the water is still high. I'm just about coping with it. I'm kind of going, I'm not sure what I'm going to do if it gets any higher. And then my wife taps me on the shoulder and says, Adrian, there's water coming up in the fireplace. And this is inside the house. In recent history, the inside of the house was lowered very slightly, only by 3 or 4 inches, but it means it's below the ground surface level. The threshold is absolutely at surface level, but you step in a couple of little steps down and then you're actually in the belly of the house. I was able to protect the house from the surface water coming, but what I didn't realise, and I didn't even know about this stuff at that time, the groundwater follows the surface water. It's a delayed path, but it will follow inexorably. That's actually what flooded our house first. And it was the rising groundwater coming up first in the fireplace, but then our house went under. Groundwater was not something I had come across.
Were you given advice and support at that stage, or was that something that you just had to get on and do by yourself?
It was very much that I've got to protect my home. But what can I do? This was a problem-solving, thinking in your feet, and I will bail and I will just do my best. And if I can keep the surface water out for long enough, maybe it will drop down, get away, and then ebb away. Because these surface floods are temporary; they don't last very long. I hoped I could do it, but it was when the groundwater started rising, I just went, "That's it. I have lost." It was that moment, hugely emotional moment, going, I have lost. That night, we basically knew we had lost the battle. All we could do was let nature take its course. And we had an absolutely torrid night where you hear the groundwater rising and start to puddle over the floors. You're acutely listening for it. You then hear the surface water reaches the door sill, because I'm not bailing anymore, and it then creeps under the door and it drops down these little steps into the rest of the house. The two types of the surface water and the groundwater are amalgamating, are mixing, are increasing in depth. Partway through the night, probably 2 o'clock in the morning, the furniture that we'd already put up on blocks ready, those blocks were wood. The furniture I hoped would actually keep the weight of the furniture would keep the blocks down. What I hadn't anticipated is that the rising water was going to lift the subfloor, which made the whole thing unstable, so the furniture starts crashing down in the middle of the night. There was some chap walking along the road and I had to call him in to help me lift the sofa out and put it out through the window as quickly as we could to save it. We had moved the small stuff, but all the big stuff was left and all propped up, hopefully to be safe. It came crashing down. It all had to get dumped on the garden overnight.
How terrifying. It's that not knowing what's going to happen, isn't it? It's not knowing when it's going to stop. The fear. Absolute
fear. It was fear for what was happening to our home. This is our first grown-up house, so what's happening to our home. Our dreams were getting destroyed. I had a 1-year-old daughter who was asleep in the next room. My wife was actually pregnant with our second child, who was due to be born around Christmas time that year. And we're kind of going, well, what happens now? When you buy a house, you stretch yourself, you sink everything you can into getting that house. And we're going, have we just lost everything? Have we actually lost everything? Because what do we do? We've absolutely no idea. You've got the immediate problem of how do we deal with the house and what happens tomorrow morning. But then you're also thinking, what happens 3, 4, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line? It was an absolutely awful experience to go through.
Appreciate you sharing it with us. It's not often that people are able to talk about these experiences and comfortable doing it. Do you find that? Do you find that people that you talk to are open to talking about what's happened in their experience of flood?
I'm happy to talk about it. It does catch me. Here we are 20 years later, nearly 20 years later, and it still catches me. It genuinely does. I find when I offer sympathy and support for people who are experiencing groundwater flooding, there's a greater understanding because I've been through it and because I voice things. I think there is a real fear of declaring that you have been a flood victim of any type of flooding, particularly groundwater flooding and surface water. We went in, we bought the house knowing there was a risk. We just felt it was small enough. There's a sort of sense that if you buy a house that is at risk, well, you take that risk and that's yours to deal with. You deal with any problems that occur as a result. When it came to buying the house, we looked at it with open eyes, and we know lots of people who live in sort of groundwater or surface water flooding areas also look at it. They know there's a risk, but that risk is changing. It's changing because of the way we've managed the landscape. It changes the way because we manage surface water. It changes because of the impacts of groundwater on the sewage system. It changes because of paving, of infrastructure. It changes because of development, and it changes because of climate change. All these actually means the risk you take at the start isn't necessarily the risk you're going to have to live with over the long term.
How did you turn from flood victim to flood warden? Was that quite a quick process?
It was a gradual evolution. When we were flooded in 2007, we had to move out of our house. We managed to find another property in the village, and we ended up living there for 6 months. During that process, I started off by requesting a visit from the county council to provide me with some advice as the lead local flood authority. How can they help me? They couldn't provide me any advice. They were woefully unprepared. They are not today. There's a lot of useful information out there, but at the time, very much in their infancy. So together with a couple of neighbours who were similarly impacted, we paid this flood consultant to come up with a solution that was going to work for us. We'd all been impacted by groundwater flooding as well as surface water. What that did was link us to a contractor who's based in Henley, who then came and did some installation for us, did the flood remediation for us, and we put in a system that was going to protect the house from surface and groundwater flooding. It was our, if you like, Project Never Again. Having put that system in, I could then go, I don't now need to look at my own property. I can look further afield. I can look at my neighbours. I can look at the community. I know what it's like to go through. I know that now I am, young enough, fit enough, able enough to help the elderly, to help the people who don't have the flood defence system in order to protect them. Conscious of the reach of a flood event in our community, it's important that actually we close the roads to prevent the cars from coming down and bringing their surface wash. We close the footpath access to the village because those can actually become dangerous. Talk to the fire service about actually you need to help this person get out of their property if necessary. It's that coordination that you just generally take the role on, and it was the help us to help ourselves mentality that I was trying to initiate. That was sort of the role that I sort of developed into this sort of flood warden role.
Did you have people that were resisting that within the community, or did everyone have a similar experience and think, do you know what, we're going to help, we're going to do what we can?
No resistance. People can only help the way that they are able to help. In the winter of 2013-2014, another really wet winter. This is again where surface water and groundwater meet. For us as a community, a worse flood than in 2007. In that time, we were all more experienced, we were all more resilient. My house was totally dry. Other houses, actually, they were now aware of the best way to manage their own properties. And so I don't think any of us put an insurance claim at the end of 2014. Everyone was coming together and pulling together and helping. And I was trying to coordinate it as best I could. Absolutely. No, I won't claim I did everything perfectly. But as a community, we all did pull together. And there were no people who went, it's your own problem, deal with it. This is the term community. You're actually working together.
That was going to be my next question, actually. How has that drawn you onto your work with river restoration and the chalk streams? Tell us how that sort of journey happened.
Once I started this sort of flood warden role as a community, a number of communities had come together, including a representative from my village. This was called the Oxford Flood Alliance. Objective, impartial, non-inflammatory. As a group of affected communities, they have a louder voice. It made sense for me to join that group. And I've been with them ever since. We've managed to make quite significant changes and improvements into the water management within the Oxford area. We've worked with Network Rail, we've worked with Thames Water, we've worked with the Environment Agency, and we've worked with the local authorities. There's now a plan which is the Oxford Flood Alleviation Scheme, which is a sort of a £180 million major infrastructure plan, which is designed to reduce the impact of flooding to hundreds of properties within the Oxford area. When Oxford is affected by flooding, it affects roads, railways, there's properties and businesses that are impacted. You've got the big hospitals that are there. So actually there really is quite a big impact on Oxford. It's been going for 19 years, but the Oxford Flood Alleviation Scheme it's gone through planning, it's getting the permissions, it's about to get spades in the ground. The Environment Agency are saying it'll be this year they start. I suspect it'll be next. It's a really good scheme. It will reduce Oxford flooding. It required me as a person to get more involved in flood risk management, but also in the ecology, because I don't want a scheme that's going to destroy the landscape in which I have to live and work, and all my friends and neighbours live, work and play. I think is really important. That had sort of increased quite a lot of my knowledge. And then when it came to, actually it was lockdown period, I was between roles at that point, and I thought, okay, I'm just turning 50, I've probably got another roll of the dice. Let's see what my next one's going to be. And I thought, well, I can either go into education or I can go into water. Two passions of my life. And I thought, well, why not try water? Why not see if I can turn the hobby that has taken up so much of my time since 2007, and I'm now in the local area perceived as something of an expert. Let's try and see if I can make a career out of that. So I did a water and environmental management master's degree, remote learning at Queen Mary's University of London. I did it from home the whole time because it was lockdown. From that, I got a position as a rivers officer for the Chiltern Society. The Chiltern Society are a charity that work across the Chilterns area, and this was a new position for them, and it was to identify river restoration projects and implement them, either using community groups right the way up to getting contractors in to do work. That was a temporary position, but I transitioned over to the organisation I'm with now, which is the Chilterns Chalk Streams Project. Been going for 30 years, trying to educate, inform and improve the chalk streams across the Chilterns national landscape. We're hosted by the Chilterns National Landscape Organisation, was formerly the AONB. They've all been renamed landscapes. natural landscapes. Now I have the role of being manager of the Chilterns Chalk Streams project. I have really exciting projects to deliver. I've got a team who deliver education, from shrouding the classroom to get kids to be more familiar with the creatures that live in the river, through to working with landowners and communities that are impacted by surface or groundwater flooding. We've got the beauty and magic of the chalk streams we have to tell people about. And through those, there's a whole series of habitat restoration and improvement projects. There is flood mitigation in there, there's environmental enhancement, there's restoring the natural form and function of the rivers. It's a fantastic job, and it's a perfect journey from me from 2007, where water to me was a frightening, disastrous, most horrendous thing possible, to now I can make a real positive difference. I get paid to walk up and down chalk streams, and it's just the most beautiful thing to be able to do.
Could you just tell us what you're doing specifically within Project Groundwater?
So I have two roles in Project Groundwater. I have a professional role and a personal role. The professional role is that Bucks Council commissioned a research project into groundwater flooding in 5 different areas across Buckinghamshire. And we partnered with the River Tame Conservation Trust and Thames 21 in order to provide the response to Bucks Council. For myself, the Chilterns Chalk Streams project worked on the Lower Hewenden. The Hewenden is a chalk stream that comes through Hewenden Manor, the former home of Benjamin Disraeli, and down into High Wycombe. And we were looking across the lower part of the Hewenden catchment from Hewenden Valley down in order to identify if there were any benefits that we could factor into the catchment plan that would reduce groundwater flooding risk. In partnership with that, the River Tame Conservation Trust were looking at the upper Hewenden Valley. They were looking at the runoff pathways coming off the hills, down the roads and through the various communities there, in order to identify where those runoff pathways could be intercepted and either held in fields or diverted off the roads into swales. And my personal engagement is, because of the community I live in, which I've described is already impacted by flooding, Project Groundwater are doing some work in South Oxford. And so I've provided community talk and support engagement to those members of South Oxford. And as part of the Oxford Flood Alliance, we're providing support to them as well. So it's providing them information, and it's helping them analyse that information and work out what to do with it in order that they can better manage their flood risk.
What surprised you most then when you sort of stepped inside the system, inside the professional side of the water industry? Was there any sort of big surprises, any big scares?
I think my key observation is how much it's changed since 2007. That's in terms of the flood response part, but also the way the different individuals now working in the system can make a difference. The Chilterns Chalk Streams project is funded partly by water companies. That might seem a bit of an anachronism to some people, because actually aren't they the ones who are wrecking the rivers in the first place? But most of the people who work in the water companies, and everybody who works in the Environment Agency, and all the people I meet out in the landscape, they all want the best for the rivers. There have been corporate decisions which have created quite a difficult situation for everybody today. We know that funding is short in many circumstances. We know that there have been cuts, basically for the last 20 years in quite a lot of the conservation industries. But actually there are amazing people there, people in my team, people in the Environment Agency, councils, the local authorities, the water companies that I work with, and they all actually want to do the best. River restoration in particular is really difficult, but actually it is some of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life. It is well worth fighting the good fight. Colleagues across the industry do such amazing things. I go to National River Restoration Centre conferences now. I hear stories from Scotland and from Cumbria and from Wales and from overseas. There are lots of people who are doing really good things with our water systems. Bringing it back to groundwater, most of those are involving retaining water in the landscape for longer, protecting properties and communities from flood risk, but enhancing the environment. You don't have to protect properties by hard infrastructure. You don't have to protect them by dredging and destroying the ecology of a river. There are very, very real ways of improving the river system, allowing the river to function more naturally. That actually is the best way to reduce flood risk.
There's a lot of positivity and hope around nature-based solutions and the work they can do. They're not a silver bullet. There are other things that have to happen as well. So where do you feel these approaches genuinely make the most difference?
A nature-based solution is usually there to address a flood risk. You have to address the flood risk where you're going to make a meaningful difference. In a groundwater-dominated system, so many of the chalk streams that I work on, the lower parts of them are groundwater dominated. They flow only when the groundwater is high enough. Times like most of 2024, where we had quite high groundwater and there was groundwater flooding, those groundwater dominated systems, it's very hard to protect communities because you haven't got anywhere to pump to. Effectively, you can't take that groundwater and pump it out to somewhere else because you're trying to pump out the entire Thames Valley. The way to benefit those communities is to hold the water upstream in the higher bits of the landscape. There are plenty of surface runoff pathways that contribute to groundwater flooding. They will bring the surface water that can't get away that then adds to that groundwater problem. You can divert those runoff pathways in the headwaters and retain that water in the landscape up there, and that then reduces the groundwater levels in the valley floors. Individual properties, they can make a difference themselves. They could do what I and my wife did to our house down the road, and we brought together the technology that is being used in places like London, where homeowners want to dig down into the London clay, create basement properties, games rooms, work areas. Those spaces have to be kept free of water. What we did for our property in 2007 was bring that technology to ground level. We were able to protect our property through a proven method, just a different application of it. So you can protect your property. Equally, you could put a pump in the ground quite near to your property if it is groundwater that you're worrying about, and just pumping that little area can create a cone of depression and lower the groundwater level in that little area just by you. And as long as you're pumping to a neighbouring field, actually you're not going to make a big difference because you're not pumping vast quantities of water. You're not going to make a significant difference to the flood risk anywhere else.
But getting that sort of information, that sort of guidance, I mean, knowing where you can pump to, what the best thing to do is, that's half the battle, isn't it?
Yes, you're correct. So back in 2007, that information was not available. Now there's a wealth of information that's out there. The Flood Re website, various county council websites across the Chilterns and I'm sure nationally have their own flood pages. The Environment Agency have a massive amount of data that's now available, including groundwater monitoring stations. And I use these in my work. The data is there for everybody to see. And so you can look at the nearest groundwater station near you. It might be some distance away, but actually the aquifers, the kind of groundwater connectivity can extend for quite a lot of miles. Find your nearest groundwater station and you can watch to see when that water starts rising. It has sort of guidelines on the charts. You can go back sometimes 20, 30 years to look at the data, and you can see when that groundwater is likely to cause you a threat, and at least then you get some advance notice of it coming, and then you have a chance to prepare. Groundwater flooding, any type of flooding, is an horrendous process to go through. I can speak from experience to communities, but I can also celebrate when the rivers return. Chalk rivers, they need groundwater. Groundwater is not bad all the time by any means. It's there all the time. There's rivers flowing under the ground all the time, everywhere. And accepting that groundwater is a fact of life is not always a negative thing. And I want us to celebrate the rivers returning when the groundwater recharge means that those chalk streams flow. I want to celebrate the return of life to the water's surface, to those rivers' surface, which enables the water crowsfoot, the watercress to grow, the fish to return, the stonefly, these rare winterborn species that require the river to go dry but thrive when it gets wet again. I want us to celebrate that as well. There's a balance here to be struck. Yes, groundwater flooding is important, and yes, it should be in everything I do in terms of the projects I deliver. But I also want us to acknowledge it's been there forever, it will be there forever. We have to live with it, and that should inform our planning decisions about where we make space for that water in our landscape so it doesn't impact infrastructure, people's daily lives, their houses and the work they go to. But at the same time, we have space for nature and space for people. We try to get that balance.
I've heard you talk about communities actually owning those rivers themselves. The rivers belong to the communities that surround them. So what does that actually look like in practice?
You're absolutely right. So I will come along to a river. Sometimes it's the first time I've seen that section of that river. I'm getting to know all of them, but I've still got some way to go. But actually, I know I'm only going to be there temporarily. There aren't enough of us to keep coming back and taking on that river and looking after it forever. So a big part of the projects is to engage the local community in understanding and learning about and then looking after in the long term that bit of river. We do this primarily through citizen science activities, and we encourage people to come out and take, we term them baseline assessments, but essentially it's looking at the river today before we do our project and seeing what it's like, and looking at the physical condition of the river, looking at the habitat that's there, looking at the creatures that are in the river. And some of this can be done from the dry bank, some of it can be done by actually getting wet, and there are different people who like different elements of that. And that data then informs the design that we go through in order to come up with the best scheme possible for that section of river. They could even be involved in implementing that river restoration project. I've used community groups for plug planting to bring instant colour, bring in the native species that would be there anyway. Let's help give nature a helping hand, particularly for a public site. I've used them to help create some of the structures in the river, the large woody debris. If we put that into a river, it creates a variety in flow types. And communities love getting involved in that, and they end up with something that looks aesthetic but does a fantastic job in improving that section of river. Once the project is completed, the community, because they're already trained in these citizen science methods, they then have ownership of that river going forward, and they can hold me to account. They can say, you said it was going to do this, the data doesn't tell us that. Why not? What have you done? Come back and do it right. They can equally, because they're getting familiar with the river, they're watching it change, they can say, a tree's come down in it. Is that a problem? If it is, can we help get rid of it? They feel motivated to do this. You give them a bit of a brief. This is what it's going to achieve. It's going to actually push the flow over. You're going to see some sediment sorting as the fine silt is left where it is, but you actually, by accelerating narrow the river, you accelerate the flow, and you can see the gravels then appearing. And they're going, you're right, it's happening now. Yeah, and a river is a dynamic system. So we're getting this instant feedback, and they absolutely love doing it.
And that learning is cyclical, isn't it? For them to learn more and then share that with other people, and then that will spread and grow. But because you've got that hands-on moment where people are actually, seeing the impact of what they're doing.
These people, it is their river. They are there for the long term. They have probably grown up by it, and now they're seeing it flourish and thrive in a way they never have before. Because they're being given some training on these citizen science methods, they're looking for different things in the river. They're looking at the river through a different set of eyes. They then become evangelists for that river. So hopefully we'll change the world one chalk stream at a time.
One chalk stream at a time. I love that. So just to draw us to a close, there's a few reflections that we can make maybe. What's the biggest misconception about groundwater flooding that you'd like to lay to rest?
Groundwater is always there. When groundwater comes to the surface, I totally accept it causes very real problems for individuals and communities. But actually, the problem is a factor of our own making. All the river is doing is saying, this has been mine for thousands and thousands of years. You've taken it. I just need to borrow it back for a bit. Let me have it back for a short while. It might be a few months because groundwater does respond more slowly than surface water. I just need it back for a bit. Then you can have it back again. And if we could learn to live alongside that river's need, we have taken this land from the river. Even for a winterbourne that looks dry on the surface over its entire length, it is still flowing below the ground. It is still there. Groundwater is still there all the time. And it's only a problem when it comes to the surface. So if we planned for that, if we actually learnt to acknowledge that we are part of the natural world, not trying to impose upon it, then I think that would make our lives so much better, so much more enriched. And I think we could learn to live with the landscape. And we create an environment which actually either allowed space for water to be elsewhere, or perhaps our infrastructure just needs to cope better. It can get wet, but equally it can dry. So our current perception, unfortunately, is all post-Second World War, when actually we had a big push to tame the landscape.
Push it to the side, push it under, keep it away, cut it down. What made us think that was the right way to do it? What on earth made us think that we were stronger than the forces of nature and water around us?
We'd come through a very, very difficult time. I mean, there had been 2 world wars in a 30-year period. There was a need to make sure people were fed. There was a need to make sure that actually we had control, because if we had control of the landscape, we could provide for people. People would be happier, and therefore what had come before would not happen again. But in doing so, what it's done is created a perception. There's still a lot of conversation around dredging of rivers. Dredging is a thing that actually everyone falls back down to, going, there won't be flooding if we dredge rivers. Well, if a river is in flood, the amount of water going down the river channel itself is dwarfed by the amount of water across the floodplains. So actually dredging is not going to make a lot of difference. By dredging, you're ripping out the ecology that's there and has grown up potentially over tens or hundreds of years and is critical to the health of that river. You're also doing a task that has to be repeated on a regular basis, because the river will create its own natural bed. It knows where it wants to be. If there is a well that you create through dredging in that bed, then that well will gradually fill up because the water won't be able to flow through it. And very often now, because dredging is something that gets done very often in an urban landscape or below an urban environment, you actually have to dispose of that waste very, very carefully because it's got contaminants in it. And so you end up having to pay some six-figure sum in order to dispose of it in a treated environment or landfill site. It's just wrong in so many ways. And it's a post-Second World War perception that dredging is right. We need to take our working with the landscape back to pre-Second World War. I'm not suggesting an environment where there are no humans in it, but I do think we need to kind of go from the 1950s through to the 1980s, our management of the landscape was wrong. We need to reflect back on what it should have been prior to that, and then bring that knowledge and add it to what we have today. And I think most people who work in and with the landscape will have a far better understanding of the right way to do things than my parents and my grandparents had.
And what is the one thing that communities can do to feel less powerless? I mean, you've certainly, your community seems to have that strength around it now, that strength of knowledge and that strength of movement and action from within. What's the one thing you'd say to other communities?
Come together, share the knowledge you have with each other. Don't be afraid of saying, my house floods, it has flooded here, here and here. Identify the sources of flooding and try and work together to try and solve them, mitigate them. I've been out and I've spoken to communities across Oxfordshire where I've given effectively the same presentation, the benefit of my experience and the way we operate. The way we operate might not work for your particular community, but by coming together, you can identify the problems and you can solve the problems and you will find solutions. There might not be the solution, but you will find solutions which will make things better. And step by step, you will get to a world which actually becomes acceptable and manageable for your community, and then you can live with the water that comes as opposed to be scared of it.
That's a beautiful way to end it, Adrian. Thank you very much. So to our listeners, if you like what you've heard, then remember you can subscribe, you can leave a review, and you can share this with other people that you think might be interested to know more from us as well. So if you've got a topic that you want to hear about in the future or discuss, or you want to come and talk to me about your personal experiences, then you can drop me an email on groundwaterrising@projectgroundwater.co.uk, and we'll be back next month.